Those are tough images. Good evening, everyone. I'm Juju Chang with ABC News Nightline. And with me on the stage here are two deeply courageous, deeply compassionate people who are determined to bear witness and to continue to sound the alarm around the world to shed light on the atrocities that you caught a glimpse of in that opening video. I want to start with you, Nick Kristof. You've had 4 reporting trips to the region in the last 4 years. I think most in the audience know that the Rohingya are a Muslim minority living in Myanmar, but give us a sense of what triggered this latest spasm of violence and why it is that they've been so persecuted for so long.
So they've always been marginalized. They speak a different dialect. They are, in a sense, an ethnic minority as well as a religious minority. And then, in a sense, they've been made scapegoats. One can argue that democracy exacerbated the problems by moving the axis in Myanmar from how much you cared about human rights and democracy, in which the military did very poorly, to how much you are anti-Rohingya or anti-Muslim. And that was an area where the military, I think, quite successfully manipulated the population and did rather better. And Facebook was sometimes used to spread these very hostile messages. There was a view among the people in Rakhine State where this has been unfolding, that the Rohingya are simply illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, which is just preposterous, but that is a widely regarded view. And
what sparked the atrocities that essentially triggered this mass migration of 700,000 Rohingya?
So one of the factors was that some Rohingya got fed up by being kept in concentration camps, by being denied rights, and turned to an armed rebellion, attacked police stations, attacked an army base, and the military responded with a scorched earth counterinsurgency. And they couldn't find the rebels, who were very poorly armed in any case. What they could find was Rohingya villagers. And they, I think, decided that the simplest solution was to completely remove the population and terrorize people until they fled across the border into Bangladesh.
I want to bring Dr. Alvi, Dr. Fastia Alvi into this conversation because you saw a lot of the results of that scorched earth policy. But as by way of background, you have a family practice in Calgary. You've been trained even here in Wisconsin in your postgraduate work. What made you volunteer, literally risk your life for such a dangerous mission?
So, Juju, first of all, I want to thank everyone, to listening to me for this one, and I'm glad to be here. So first time I heard about Rohingya back in 2015 when my husband Tahir, he went to those Rohingya camps inside Burma as a volunteer to distribute food rations. So that was my first introduction. And so Rohingyas, as Nick said, are indigenous people of Burma. They're living in Rakhine State in their ancestral lands for many, many hundreds of years. So They were always citizens, they always elected their representatives until 1988 when the military government, they took away their citizenship. And that's when the persecution against Rohingyas reached to the level of apartheid, and now that has led to genocide. So when Tahir came back, he told me horrible stories that Rohingyas were facing, like forced starvation and rampant diseases. He was so disturbed that he couldn't eat at dinner table days after coming back. And then last year, as Nick said, that, you know, with the horrific campaign of violence that started last year in August, there is a human element to it. I was hearing all the stories of massacres, you know, violence, rape. And then I heard from ICNA Relief Director, Mr. Shaukat, that there are about 90,000 pregnant women, literally a handful of doctors taking care of them. So as a physician, I thought that, you know, I must help. So the conditions on the ground, what I saw, it really horrified and shocked me. I knew I won't be able to look at myself in the mirror if I didn't do anything, something to help.
And so tell us some of the stories, those heartbreaking stories that you had spill out as you were treating so many of these people. I know we have an image of you in the refugee camp, but you met one boy who was suffering from polio.
So as a doctor, I tried my best to treat those people who were suffering in so many different ways, but there's some patients that are just stuck with me. So the first boy, his name is Ahmed. He's about 4 or 5-year-old boy. So he was found by his neighbor in the forest 4 days after his entire family was killed by Burmese army. He was like starving, was very weak, and he was holding tight on a plastic shopping bag. And when the neighbor looked inside, it had his mother's and sister's clothes who were dead like 4 days ago. So he was holding on to what was left of his family. It really shook me. I didn't know how to walk away with this child. So children are the main victims of this genocide, along with women. And as a mother, I was unprepared to see so many unaccompanied children in those camps. There are about 40,000 orphan kids. Most of them, they don't know where their parents are. And some of them, they have seen their parents cut into pieces in front of them.
You were saying as a mother this affected you deeply, especially when you met another little girl who was the same age as your daughter, 11-year-old.
Yeah. So that girl also stuck with me because one day we went into a tent. There were 2 women inside. So one woman shared with us her story, that how her husband was killed, how her baby was thrown into the fire, how she was raped for 15 days. So while we were listening, I noticed a small girl sitting on the back in dark, crying quietly. She was the same age as my daughter, Iman. And when I looked at her, her tears, her face, I felt myself paralyzed. My heart sank. And, but you know, her tears now, they have become my driving force to advocate for her, to speak for her, to become her voice. So Burma is using genocide as a weapon of, is using rape as a weapon of genocide.
Systematic rape.
It's systematic rape.
Absolutely.
To demoralize them.
And those are powerful tears that are affecting you to this day. And yet the injuries that you saw, whether it was the machete wounds or the bullet wounds, tell a tale of the type of violence that we're seeing in the region.
So we had seen lots of musculoskeletal injuries, lots of patients with wounds on their back because they were shot as they were trying to flee. And I like to point out here when I hear someone says that will Aung San Suu Kyi will ever be letting them to get back. She wasn't content with letting them leave alive. She wanted them dead.
Nick, let me bring you in. You've heard countless stories that are similar to this that shake us all to our core. Tell us the story of Dilbar and Noor, especially in the framework of some of the skepticism that's out there.
So I met Dilbar and Noor in their hut, and there they are. And I was trying to focus on one village to double check, because then I could compare everybody's stories, and I could look for satellite images of that village. And the story of Dilbar and Noor was fairly typical. Dilbar's husband was murdered in front of her. She had 4 children. First, the oldest boy was shot dead. along with the other men and boys of the village. Then she and her 3 youngest children were led along with other women in groups of 5 to a hut to be raped. The 2 younger children had their throats cut. Noor, who's 10, had a machete smashed down on her head. She still has the scars on her head. She passed out. The soldiers thought she was dead, and then the soldiers raped Dilbar beside the bodies of her children, locked the door of the hut, and set it on fire. She woke up from the smoke. She frantically checked the bodies of her children, saw that Noor was still breathing, broke through the wall of the hut carrying Noor, and they, Noor is going to school now, and she's trying to focus in class in this refugee camp. How can you possibly try to study arithmetic when you've seen things like that? And, this is not just some soldiers who got carried away here or there. This is, as Dr. Alvey suggested, this is not rape as a collateral byproduct of a conflict. This is a policy of rape. This is a policy of throwing babies into bonfires, of killing children. And if there are some generals from Myanmar watching, they would say, well, it worked. We did terrorize the Rohingya population and drove them out. And so a majority of Rohingya have fled. And yeah, we paid a modest price internationally. There are some people who criticize us and wring their hands, but it's a price worth paying. And I think that is something that we in the international community just cannot tolerate, to have generals think that they got away with it.
Let's talk about the response from the human rights community, because they are actively trying to verify all of these accounts. These are not just anecdotal accounts. These are corroborated by multiple witnesses that you've interviewed from the same village. Amnesty International has satellite imagery of 345 villages wiped off the map, and yet 58 human rights organizations have called for sanctions. Do you think that's an effective tool? Let's start with you, Dr. Alvey.
So, first of all, the thing that frustrates me since I got involved with this Rohingya people after my trip, that yes, world leaders are paying attention to it, but no one is taking actually practical steps to stop this genocide. So I'm a physician, not a political expert. My impression of our institutions like UN, EU, International Criminal Court was that they make people accountable and they protect human rights. And their motto, never again, means never again. They are letting it happen again, like they did in Rwanda, Bosnia. It frustrates me that we are not doing anything now, and we are going to probably regret it 10 years from now. So I think, as you said, answer to your question, that sanctions, I think sanctions is the only solution, and full sanctions, economic as well as military sanctions, and bring those criminals to justice who are treating Rohingya people like worse than insects, and to restore their citizenship.
Nick, you said that the Myanmar government has been susceptible to sanctions in the past.
Yeah.
Targeted sanctions.
We have some experience in what works on pressuring Myanmar, because for years we were trying to have them release Aung San Suu Kyi and hold democratic elections. And we tried various things. We tried general sanctions on manufacturing products in, I think it was 2002, and that essentially failed. That put a lot of young garment workers out of work, but didn't change Myanmar policy. Then we tried targeted sanctions on key figures close to the regime, and essentially that worked. That kind of pressure did not hurt the ordinary population, but it did wake up leaders.
You brought up Aung San Suu Kyi, and I know that in many ways the human rights community has lost an icon in some ways.
10 years ago, she would have been on this stage and we would all be applauding her.
And so many people, Desmond Tutu, all the female Nobel laureates, have spoken out harshly against her. Is that merited?
I think it absolutely is, and I say that as somebody who had tremendous respect for Aung San Suu Kyi and was such a icon, as you say, of courage, of speaking up for human rights, and to now see her not only be passive in the face of what I agree with Dr. Alvey, I believe it is a genocide, is heartbreaking. And I think that what is happening, that probably all along she wasn't quite as much of a human rights advocate as we hoped, but also I think that she wants to be a politician and she wants her party to win. And the truth is that if you want to be a successful politician in Myanmar, in today's democracy there, then you can't speak up for the Rohingya. And so she has to choose. And she chose democratic success at the cost, I think, of her soul.
My goodness, those are very stark terms, and I think terms that we all understand on this stage. Dr. Alvey, I know you have plans to return. I know that there's a level of dire straits because the monsoon season is approaching. Tell us about the danger there, but also the sustainability with which you're trying to train and gird volunteers locally.
So there's a lot of anxiety lately among the refugees and the local Bangladeshi government and Bangladeshi people because Bangladesh is the wettest country on earth. When it rains for months. Those plastic sheets and bamboo tents, they're not going to hold 60 to 80 inches of rain. So flooding and the mudslides are waiting to happen. I was talking to the camp doctor last week. He said that, you know, Dr. Alvey, I know that people are going to die, but the question is how many? So world needs to prepare now, not when the death toll is skyrocketing. So I think Bangladesh community needs, Bangladesh government needs helicopters, rescue boats in June when the monsoon hits its peak, because those tents on barren, muddy hills, they're not going to hold long.
You're talking about
so there's a disaster
structures
within a disaster just waiting to happen.
waiting to happen. But I also want to follow up that you want to try to train local Bangladeshis in order to make it a more sustainable proposition.
So after my trip, I was struggling. I was talking with my colleagues here in US and in Canada that, you know, what we can do for those people. There are a lot of sick people, and they are suffering in so many different ways, as I said. So it's not a solution that, first I thought that, you know, I will send my colleagues 2 weeks rota system, and then but I said that, you know, it's not sustainable. So with the airfare, with taking time off their practice, so what we did, we are hiring local Bangladeshi doctors, and we are paying them and buying medication, and then sort of sponsoring medical camps. I think it's a little bit of longer-term solution, but I don't know for how long my colleagues will still keep getting funds for it.
Give us a sense of some of the NGOs that have been doing great work in the region, because I know people here are concerned, want to be able to give their support in whatever way they could.
So I think it's very important to support the local organization who are working on the ground. So one organization I work with, a Small Kind Bangladesh, I think they are doing a good job. ICNA Relief Canada, they are supporting them well for the medical camps, for the food rations. And I started sort of my own humanity auxilium after this plight. I said that, you know, what can I do to, you know, it's basically to have the doctors and the healthcare professionals and the humanitarians all under one roof, that how we can make a difference in their life.
It's remarkable how much one person can affect change. Thank you so much, Dr. Alvey. I want to ask you, I mean, truly, it's... Nick turned to me backstage and said, "Don't you feel inadequate?" And I said, "Entirely."
I want to go to med school now.
Right,
and,
exactly.
Follow Dr. Alvey.
Nick, I feel it would be remiss for me not to bring up Facebook. They've been in the spotlight all week, Mark Zuckerberg on Capitol Hill, and yet Facebook has also been criticized in Myanmar for a spike in hate speech, anti-Rohingya hate speech, but also some censorship of survivor stories every time they get posted. What is your sense?
So one of the complications is that the internet arrived in Myanmar. A few years ago, there was, internet essentially was not available. And then they did allow it, the government allowed it, relaxed the rules, allowed cell phones to have better bandwidth, and Facebook immediately spread all over. Facebook became quite popular, but it didn't have any physical presence in Myanmar. There was no office. Nobody was really looking at what was happening. And in that context, you had some Buddhist extremists, a famous monk called Varantu among them, who began peddling really virulent hate speech. And I mean, completely dehumanizing words.
Often coming from the mouths of Buddhist monks. Which
It's
was very,
very
the cognitive dissonance there was extreme.
It's very weird. And the Dalai Lama, to his credit, has spoken up for this. It's a different sect of Buddhism, and they don't pay much attention. But Facebook, I think it's fair to say that they were slow in responding to some of this hate speech. I also must say, though, that I think that in some cases it's just difficult that you have, you know, in my most recent trip, I was in some little villages, and they were circulating completely false images, claiming that these were, you know, Rohingya slaughtering Buddhists. And these were fake, but these were local people here and there, and they weren't getting a huge amount of traction. But I talked to even some Buddhists there who said that Facebook has fundamentally been a force for harm in Myanmar, because it has encouraged on both sides this kind of extremism, this dehumanization of the other, and has aggravated these tensions. And probably has been, I mean, one of the really interesting things is that the military in Myanmar learned a lot of hacking from the Russians, and there is a theory that seems to have some basis for it, that some of these things may be circulated by the Myanmar military deliberately to spread this kind of hatred, and if so, Facebook tolerated that.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to talk about something we were talking about off stage, which is the idea that blame and shame have an impact on this regime. What can we in this audience, what can we do to help raise the voices of those speaking out against this kind of violence?
If people are looking for how they can help, and one thing I would suggest is some organizations that are there on the ground. I mean, there's an amazing Bangladeshi organization called BRAC, B-R-A-C, that is a huge presence there. I would also emphasize human rights organizations, that fundamentally the way this is going to end is not just provision of services, but it's also going to be advocacy. And so Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, a group called Fortify Rights, which is focused on Myanmar. And also we have political levers. There was a bill that passed through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that does apply targeted sanctions to Myanmar because of the Rohingya. And it does seem to have broad support. Right now, it is stalled. Mitch McConnell has stalled it because he has always had a very high regard for Aung San Suu Kyi. And I understand that, I did too, but I would welcome people to encourage Senator McConnell to have a broader view about the importance of bringing about change in Myanmar.
You also said small things like the Voice of America could have an impact.
So one of the heartbreaking things is that the Rohingya who are, right now, those remaining in Myanmar are either locked in concentration camps or they're confined to their villages, denied education, denied health care. And so in village after village, these village elders are trying desperately to educate their children themselves under a tree, without textbooks, without teachers, and without anything. And so Voice of America, if it were to broadcast lessons, many people in the villages do have radios, they have solar-powered batteries that could be used, and this might be one way of giving these Rohingya schools some material, some way to educate their children until this nightmare passes.
I want your final thoughts, Dr. Alvi, on, a lot of times you feel like you lose your faith in humanity, and you've seen a lot of the atrocity up close and personally. What would you say? What was your takeaway during your time there?
So, For my final words, I would say that, you know, as a human being, not being a doctor or Canadian, it's really shocking for me that that genocide is going on that part of the world and how silent our community is. It's really a shame for me. That little boy, Ahmed, that girl in the red, their lives really don't matter. There's like endless stories, like Nick said, that, you know, I have lots and lots. I can sit here all night and tell you all those horrible stories that I witnessed. But I believe that my fellow Canadians and the people in the US, they are very compassionate. They like helping out. It's hard to give a damn what's going on the other side of the world. It's easy to take care of the people that are happening in our own backyard. I understand that we have our own challenges and we have our own hardships. But those people, I think they have gone through hell, and they are living in literally garbage condition. We need to stand up. And Nick, I agree with Nick, all the suggestions. And I think US Senate should vote for the Bill 2060, and that will impose sanctions on Burma. It's a very complex, but...
It's incredible. I want to thank you both for being here. I'm going to close out with a quote that Nick had in one of his columns from Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, who wrote, "Whenever men and women are persecuted because of race, religion, or political views, that place must, at the moment, become the center of the universe." So thank you, Nick, and thank you, Dr. Alvi, for bringing them to the center of our stage tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.